gentlemen, I am Jonathan Moore, the Director of the Institute of Politics, and I want to welcome all of you to the 10th anniversary of the Institute of Politics of the John F. Kennedy School of Government and to this afternoon's symposium on political reform. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, who not only played a very important role in designing the whole concept of the Institute, but who has served for that 10-year period on the Senior Advisory Committee, namely Senator Edward Kennedy. Ed?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. The Red Sox are ahead 2-0. Dwight Evans just hit a home run, and we'll keep you informed as the afternoon goes on. We can be fortunate it isn't tomorrow when the Celtics are playing down at Philadelphia. We would have even a smaller group. But it's the storm clouds. It isn't really bright and sunny out on the riverbank, no matter what you hear. Let me welcome all of you here this afternoon and to indicate that we hope that this will be a free-flowing session. We want to have the participation of those in the audience. We look forward to their active involvement, to their questions, to their comments. We're hopeful they'll be not either lecturing or making long or prolonged speeches, but participating in helping us examine the whole issue of electoral reform. We know that there are many other aspects of reform that I'm sure many in this audience are concerned with and have led various discussion groups on, but we're going to try and, if we can, deal with this issue. It'll be approached from different points of view, but we're going to hopefully have that as the central theme of the discussion this afternoon. We're extremely fortunate to have as members of our panels individuals who have had a very strong association with the Institute of Politics over a very significant period of time. Most have been fellows, all have been fellows actually, of the Institute, with the exception of Professor Burns, who was very much involved in the earliest days in the development of the Institute and working with the members of the family and in devising the Kennedy Institute of Politics. So we were looking for those that would be able to make a rather important contribution to the development of this subject, and we were able to reach into those that have had a close association with the Institute, and we're delighted to welcome them here today. They're no strangers to, I'm sure, either the student body or friends of the Institute, and I'll just mention them very briefly, and then we'll get started. First, John Gardner is one of the really outstanding citizens of our nation, who is former president of the Carnegie Foundation, the former secretary of HEW, the founder of Common Cause, who has been extremely active and involved in the whole efforts for electoral reform and the other reform movement in the Congress and Senate, as well as in the state and local reform, and distinguished author. And he will begin our program, but before recognizing him, we'll just introduce the other members. James Mcgregor Burns, a Pulitzer Prize winner in the field of history, a distinguished professor, a author about a senator who went on to be a president of the United States, and an author about a senator who didn't. So we're glad to have Professor Burns here today. Dave Broda, perhaps the leading political commentator in our country on the present politics, who's studied and reviewed all of the recent political history, and has been one commentator who has continued his interest and his critique and constructive comments on the whole issue of electoral reform, and has been extremely active in the Institute. Dave Stockman, Congressman Stockman, who was a fellow at the Institute, a Republican member of the House of Representatives from the 4th District in the state of Michigan, holds an extremely important positions in the House of Representatives on the interstate and foreign commerce, which will deal with the whole energy issues, on the House Administration Committee, which will also concern itself with the issues of universal registration. He's been extremely involved in that issue and is one of the most articulate spokesmen in the House on the issue of welfare reform. And Barney Frank, who has had a broad experience and association with the Institute, has been very much involved in municipal government as a key advisor to Kevin White, has had been a close association with Mike Harrington in terms of the congressional government, and has been a constant observer of the political scene here in the state as well as in the national and scene, and always makes a very special contribution. Without any further comments from me, we'll recognize John Gardner and welcome our panelists and look forward to their comment. The form we'll follow is we'll ask both John Gardner and Professor Burns speak from 12 to 15 minutes. We'll have brief comments from 5 to 8 minutes by the other members of the panel, and then we're going to welcome the participation of our audience here today. Mr. Gardner.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to have a place on this program. I had the honor, Senator, as you know, of working with your brothers, and you and I have been allies in many important fights. I'm going to begin by speaking of one concrete example of political reform, the work of Common Cause. Just an example chosen at random, Senator. In the spring of 1970, Common Cause was nothing but an idea. It had no staff, no name, no money, no offices. Today it has a reasonably stable membership of 250,000 and has helped to bring about historic changes in our political system. Historic changes are those which last more than a year and a half. First among the historic changes was a drastic overhaul of campaign financing. And lest you assume that this was inspired by Watergate, we began our efforts in 1970, and the first major legislation was in 1971. The noted journalist Richard Strout described the 1974 legislation as one of the few genuinely revolutionary changes in American politics in modern times. The new law, the 1974 law, restored dignity to the presidential election. There are improvements that must be made in the present law, but the gains are starkly clear. While we're on the subject, I should point out that practically all of the recent revelations of illegal corporate payments, beginning with the illegal campaign gifts here at home and culminating in the huge corporate bribes to foreign officials, are consequences in one way or another of one single lawsuit brought by Common Cause to force disclosure of secret contributors to the 1972 Nixon campaign. Once we laid our hands on that list, if I may quote Milton's Paradise Lost, Book 4, line 918, all hell broke loose. The special prosecutor took over, the SEC moved in, the IRS joined the battle, private litigants did, and the end is not yet. All because of one lawsuit by a group of citizens who wouldn't let go until they learned the truth. Second among the historic changes was establishment of the principle of open government. As recently as half a dozen years ago, most of government activities at all levels were conducted behind closed doors. Today, the majority of states have open government laws, and most committees of the U.S. Senate and the House conduct their business, their bill drafting sessions, in the open, and it works. Several years of concrete experience in one state, 8 years of concrete experience, confirm the fact, so astonishing to some, that you can do the public business publicly and still have due regard for necessary exceptions. The third achievement is that every one of the 50 states has now passed one or another of the Common Cause accountable government measures, and that adds up to the biggest wave of state legislature reform since the nation was founded. And Common Cause helped, and I stress the word helped, to bring about the greatest burst of congressional reorganization since early in this century. Vigorous and forward-looking members of the House and the Senate played the key inside role, and Common Cause was the principal outside force. Its impact on the seniority system was particularly notable, as Congressman Eddie Hebert keeps saying. Well, I won't bore you with further Common Cause activities. I simply want to say that we focused on government because the citizen cannot accomplish the other things that need to be done unless we first repair our instruments of self-government. We did not choose at random from the innumerable deficiencies in government which we might have tackled. We have had clear, explicit, and limited concerns with respect to government. We believe that it should be accessible, accountable, and responsive. And we discovered that the most powerful obstacles to that kind of government were money and secrecy. The scandalous capacity of money to buy political outcomes and the old bad political habit of doing the public's business behind closed doors. Now, observers following our concern for these matters often describe us as concerned for the morality and ethics of government. We ourselves practically never use words such as ethics and morality, partly because they suggest aspects of human behavior which are not easily legislated, and partly because the words suggest that we're mainly engaged in the ancient struggle to make humankind moral. And we applaud that goal, but we see it as a distant one. And we have more immediate objectives. Taking humans as they are, we're interested in the concrete, practical steps that can make our instruments of self-government work. I can't stress strongly enough that corruption, backroom deals, secret fixes, quite aside from their moral repulsiveness, finally result in government that just doesn't work. Finally, the insiders can't even save themselves. The intricately rigged system doesn't even serve those who rigged it. I give you New York City. You may not want it, but... And the confidence of the public suffers catastrophically in the process. Well, because Common Cause has done its share, sometimes more than its share, in working toward these goals, some people have jumped to the conclusion that the organization is hostile to politics. But Common Cause's leaders have said repeatedly that high-minded citizens who look down on politics are going to have to learn that we need our politicians. Just as we must reject those who corrupt the public process, so we must support those politicians who risk their careers in the public interest. In any society, it's inevitable that equally worthy groups will want mutually incompatible things. And unless we want such differences settled by the whims of a dictator, or unless we want to shoot it out, we're going to have to turn to the much maligned arena of politics. And that brings me to the subject of citizen participation, which is certainly at the heart of many of our troubles today. When you look at the percentage voting, casting their votes in the presidential election, you're keenly aware of the problem. In the 1960s, citizen participation, in the broadest sense of the term, was a great slogan. I had my doubts about some of the forms that it took, but I believed that the slogan connoted something supremely important. So along with a lot of other conscientious Americans, I sat through literally hundreds of earnest meetings on very hard seats in high school auditoriums and churches and union halls and so on. Lots of healthy views were expressed, along with a lot of nonsense, of course, but no matter how sound the view or consensus, it rarely extended beyond that meeting on that particular evening. The thousands, even tens of thousands of citizen groups meeting around the country weren't hooked into any central nervous system, so to speak. And yet there existed and had existed for 2 centuries what one might conceivably think of as a kind of central nervous system, namely the web of government, which had been established presumably originally as an instrument for citizen participation. Now that ancient system wasn't working, obviously, which is precisely why aroused citizens repaired to the high school gymnasium. Well, it's no secret what was wrong with the old networks of government. Some parts were paralyzed by their own mediocrity. Some parts had been bought up lock, stock, and barrel by the moneyed interests. Some parts were wholly anachronistic and required total redesign to serve contemporary purposes. Well, it struck us that it might be a worthy venture in behalf of citizen participation to repair that ancient system, or at least begin. And the goal of participation dictated some of the repairs we had to make. Citizens can't participate effectively if they don't know what's going on. So a substantial measure of openness had to be one of our goals. Citizens can't participate effectively unless the system is so designed that they can call it to account. So accountability had to be one of our goals. Well, now, to many devotees of participation, local activity on local problems, face-to-face interchange is the name of the game. That is what participation is about for many people. I respectfully disagree, at least in part. We must learn the arts of local participation on local problems, but the most puzzling problem of citizen participation today is how in the world you can enable an individual citizen to have any significant input in coping with the overarching problems that affect the whole nation and in some degree the whole world. And it is at that end of the spectrum that we have been working. And back to the kind of drop in participation which is so damagingly reflected in the election, in the voting turnout. Citizen action of the kind that we have been stimulating is good not only for the political system, it's good for the citizen. It gives these citizens a feeling that they haven't had for a long, long time, that America is their venture, theirs to preserve or theirs to neglect, and perhaps through neglect to destroy. And citizens who don't bother to vote, in my opinion, are many of them, perhaps most of them, suffering from a rather familiar malady. They no longer think it's their venture. The task at the moment, in my opinion, if you want real participation in electoral politics or any other aspect of our society, is to recreate a motivated society in which the citizens feel that they somehow have a stake in this great impersonal effort. And I do believe that Common Cause has played a role in that effort. We've enabled people to work to make government respected, and in the longer run, I think we will prove the thesis that good constituents produce good leaders. We've demonstrated that citizens need not be intimidated by the vastness, the impersonality, and the technical character of modern life, nor by the huge resources in the hands of those who wield power. Citizens can throw a lasso of responsibility, of accountability over the highest pinnacle of organized power. Now let me say a few concluding words about social change. Some people think of our society as something, our system as something so sacred that you can't tamper with it. You mustn't touch it. It just is supposed to sit there down through the centuries like a pyramid. You don't think of changing a pyramid. You may want to dust it occasionally, but you wouldn't think of adding a wing or a portico or altering its nature. Other people think of our society as a kind of a tinker toy. You don't like it? Take it apart and reassemble it. If you're bright, you've probably got a much better idea than the designer. Disassemble it, put it together after your own image. Well, our society doesn't fit any of these images. No society the anthropologists know anything about fits either of those. Our society is much more in the nature of an organism, not unlike the organism that created it, the human being. It has a past, it has a memory, it lives on continuity as well as change. Social change is generally incremental, and you don't blueprint the change you want, then put it into effect and go home and forget about it. You try, you make mistakes, you try again, you fail, you try again, you partially succeed, you relearn, and so on. That is the nature of social change. The miraculous thing in this country is that social change wells up out of the people, not out of great institutions, governmental or corporate. If we had waited for the civil rights movement or the women's movement or the environmental movement or any of these great movements to well up out of a government agency, we'd still be waiting. You know, you wouldn't want to hold your breath for that. Now, no one, it's my last word on social change, no one should offer the citizen visions of a perfect society. Nothing is ever finally safe. There are no utopias. Every battle is fought and refought. Each generation has to work to recreate the values that it will live by. Justice is always imperiled by the unjust. Always someone has too much power. Always someone has too little. Life is tumultuous. It's a constant losing and regaining of balance, a continuous struggle, never an assured victory. If you hear me saying that the citizen's job is never finished, you hear me correctly. Good leadership is of great importance, but ultimately we have to save ourselves. That has always been true and always will be true. World without end. Thank you.
Professor Burns.
Mr. Chairman, sitting next to a gentleman who I suppose could well be called Mr. American Reform, and in a meeting presided over by a United States Senator with a distinguished record on reform, and meeting in the bowels of a university which for over 300 years has been the fount of reform to the steady annoyance of most of the rest of the population, I'm going to have the temerity not to oppose reform, I would not quite dare do that, but to take a somewhat oblique approach to this question of electoral reform and reform in general. I would venture the thought that someday, when historians gain some perspective on the past 100 years of American history, that they will be impressed by the following anomaly: the contrast between the intensity of middle-class reform and the success of middle-class reform on the one hand, and on the other hand, the poverty and paucity of wide and deep working-class political organization in this nation. More specifically, I think they will be impressed or depressed with the extent to which much of that middle-class reform struck, wittingly or unwittingly, at working-class political organization. And by working class, I mean low-income workers, blacks, agricultural workers, immigrants, poor ethnics, and the poor generally. Let me remind you, as we celebrate reform, of the literacy tests that were designed to keep the less educated from voting, and especially to keep the immigrants from voting, those who could not speak English particularly, no matter how intelligent they might have been. The registration requirements that classically have been used for that and other purposes. The much touted civil service reform that attacked the patronage that had provided working class people with jobs, that had especially helped immigrants enter into the job market. The Hatch Act, adopted in the New Deal days, in part because of the influx of low-income workers into New Deal agencies. Convention reform of more recent years, which, with all its very good points, particularly in relation to participation, still came to symbolize, particularly in the 1972 convention, a party that seemed to have made reforms that were perhaps desirable on the one hand, but somehow had excluded labor and other traditional elements in the Democratic Party on the other. And finally, of what could be a longer list, a short list today, the adoption of the primary system around the turn of the century, which was, among other things, an attack on bossism. But that bossism had to some degree acted for working class people in this country, especially again for the immigrant and the ethnic. I doubt that I need demonstrate here that the primaries had a crippling effect on party organization. I think that's pretty well accepted by scholars and practitioners. It had that crippling effect on party organization, mainly by robbing the party of its most vital function, choosing candidates. That's essentially what parties are supposed to do. We all know this, but it's not so well recognized, I think, that that great reform, essentially a middle class, or if you wish, an elitist reform, also struck at the political potential of working class people. Now, of course, we've never had a strong, united working class movement. This nation is inhospitable to that kind of movement. The divisions between black and white, between native and immigrant, between skilled and unskilled, all of which, of course, were played upon by the adversaries of the workers. All these things have made working class political organization most difficult in this country. But the middle class reforms that I've listed and others also hurt the only practical grassroots instrument for working class people in this country, namely the political party. Whether it was the Democratic Party or the Republican Party in the old days or the Progressive Party or whatnot. In this country, it has turned out that because of a very different historical tradition and ideological tradition from many of the other democracies, a straight working class movement of a socialistic type has turned out to be impossible. And unless labor was going to be involved in the kind of charismatic movements, populist movements that so often turned out badly in the past, the only really practical instrument for them was the old-fashioned American political party as we knew it in the 19th century. And hence, I would argue that again, wittingly or unwittingly, I'm not suggesting a conspiracy theory here, anything that struck as vitally as party primaries did, or should I say non-party primaries, at party organization, was bound to cripple the potential of the American party for workers, defined as I've generally defined them. And it's very interesting, referring to Mr. Gardner's point about participation. And we all believe in participation, and that's one of the great reform goals in this country. It is very interesting that after decades of emphasis on political participation, that our rate of political participation is dropping, as we all know. Now, finally, in terms of the strategies for the working class, in lieu of a social movement, a working class movement that was impossible, and in lieu of a party organizational potential that has also now perhaps been made impossible for all time, working class people had turned historically to the White House and to the strong president, the much maligned strong president. But of course, since Vietnam and Watergate, again, various reform measures, many of them very good in themselves, would limit presidential power, and in that sense would limit the possibility of working class people achieving the great social and economic egalitarian reforms and measures that historically they've been seeking. Now, don't get me wrong. I happen individually to support most of the reforms that, for example, Common Cause has supported. I'm very happy that my favorite United States Senator does take that leading position on reform. I have to support these reforms. My wife is a member of Common Cause. While I've been out as a Democrat working with fellow Democrats in the bars and union halls and other low joints, my wife has been communing with John Gardner in her boudoir, communing with him on his crusades. I'm not saying he was in the boudoir, but see, certainly
Are you sure?
No. I know you're ubiquitous, but my argument is not, as I say, essentially against reform. My argument is that these reform issues have unduly preoccupied us. My argument is that the main political problem in this country is not lack of reform, but lack of political organization on behalf of the great mass of low-income people in this country. Everybody else is organized except that group that most needs it. And that this lack of political organization, the kind of political organization that would foster more and better leadership, which is another great goal that John Gardner and I would agree on, the need for leadership, the need for responsible and accountable leadership is lacking, and hence equally important ingredient is lacking, and that is accountable and responsible and involved and participatory and organized followership. This relative lack of interest on the part of journalists and politicians and academics has been, I think, exemplified in such as the following. The fact that not only our national parties but state and local parties have been declining before our very eyes in recent years. The spread of state presidential primaries, that was pretty well publicized last year, but it's startling to think at the extent of state presidential parties. We've almost adopted the national primary through the back door of state presidential primaries without really fastening on what we're doing. And of course, primaries are always the enemy of party. We haven't really thought very much about the possibility of taxpayer funding of parties and not just candidates. The debate you hear about funding of politics is always the funding of candidates. Very little discussion of the funding of parties, and yet a number of states have run very interesting experiments on funding of state parties, but I doubt very much that you've heard much about that. The establishment in some states of caucus systems that have helped keep the parties going. Last year you heard a lot about these strange caucus arrangements in certain states, but compared to the excitement of the party primaries, there was not very much coverage of this. The fact that some states are perhaps going to help resolve this problem of the pernicious impact of primaries on parties by adopting combinations of primaries and caucuses and conventions, Colorado is an example, that could lead us in most interesting directions if we want to revitalize basic political organization in this country, but we don't hear very much about what Colorado is doing. And let me just say in conclusion that the problem is probably going to intensify, and let me give you one example squarely in the area of electoral reform, and that is the adoption of the national presidential party, presidential primary. If we do adopt the one-shot or perhaps the two-shot national presidential primary, I think it probably will finally sound the death knell of organized political parties in this country. But if that so-called reform should be followed by the adoption of the direct popular election of presidents, we would then have a combination that I would consider very ominous for the future of American politics. And here again, this puts me into something of a dilemma, because I strongly support direct election of presidents. I think at the end of this long process, there ought to be just a final, straight decision, such as one would hope to get out of any great contest, whether athletic or political. And everybody should be brought into that without complications, dramatic finale. I believe in that for all the usual and some of the unusual reasons advanced for direct election of president. But I must say, it gives me pause to think that we might come to election years, presidential election years, in 1984 or 88 or the year 2000, when that kind of direct presidential election will have followed a direct presidential primary. And when I think of the volatility of the American people, Mr. Chairman, and the extent to which the media can directly communicate the views of leaders to the people and create that direct relationship which bypasses political organization, it fills me with some worry that in some year when tremendous forces are loose in this country, not the benign forces that were operating in 1960 that brought John Kennedy to the presidency, a man who came in from the outside, came in from the cold essentially, or in 1976 that brought Carter into the presidency, but chauvinistic forces or Joe McCarthy type forces or other forces that might be sweeping this country. The combination of those two things does deeply concern me. I want to say again, I support direct election of the president as a constituent of the senator, but I do think on the party side that's a very serious problem. So, to summarize, sure we need reform, but we need political leadership and political renewal even more. And I hope very much that that kind of renewal will be very much on the agenda of the Kennedy Institute during the next 10 years, just as it has been during the past decade. Thank you.
Okay. Had extremely constructive opening statements. I'm hopeful that as we move through on the discussion that we can focus in our panel here on at least four areas. I'm sure there are other. One is the Election Day registration, the public financing aspect, and we have heard Professor Burns talk about the presidential primaries, some of the various alternative ways of dealing with it, and the direct election issue. Seems to me those are four areas which I'd hope that maybe our panel could focus in and against the framework of our opening commentators, or any of the other matters of electoral reform that they think would be useful and helpful. And I know Mr. Broda has strong views on several of those issues, and I'm sure he'll elaborate on them at this time. Mr. Broda.
Thank you, Senator. I can summarize my views on those four issues very quickly by saying I'm against them, and for reasons that I trust will come out in the course of the debate. I guess it is necessary at this kind of a session to say, to enter the disclaimer at the beginning, that I am not hostile to reform either. Some of my best friends are reformers, and some of the things that have given us most pleasure to write about in the newspaper business have been reforms and reformers. There was a wonderful reform passed just 2 years ago, the Campaign Finance Reform Act. This week, the Federal Election Commission published a survey of the first set of candidates, the 1976 candidates who operated under that act, and they found something rather surprising. First of all, those candidates in majority said that, surprise of surprises, the Campaign Finance Reform Act had weakened the role of the political parties in their campaigns. Second, it said that, surprisingly again, that it had enhanced the already considerable advantages of the incumbents in their judgment. And this, interestingly, Senator, was an opinion that was shared by those who were incumbents in 1976 and who responded with, I think, remarkable candor in this survey, that by a margin of about 3-2, yes, they did think that they were better off than they would have been thanks to the benefits of the Campaign Finance Reform Act, which they coincidentally had passed themselves just 2 years before. That is a wonderful law. It was, as you recall, created in response to the scandals of extortion of campaign money in the Nixon campaign, and with the typical sort of accuracy of targeting that so much of the reform movement has, it dealt with that pressing problem by making it quite literally, I think, impossible for either Senator Kennedy or Representative Stockman to put on their campaign buttons the names of their party's presidential candidates unless they had a letter from their mothers specifically giving them permission to do so. The law also facilitated the election of a president, and this is the great claim I think that is made in its behalf, who could say quite honestly to the American people that he owed the special interests nothing, and then could go on to prove that fact in his early days in office by taking a position on minimum wage legislation, on economic policies, on import policies, which made George Meany sort of long for the good old days of William McKinley. It produced a president who, in fulfillment of his pledge that he owed the special interests nothing, appointed an attorney general and a deputy attorney general who were opposed by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It produced a president who sent the Senate a tax bill which left Senator Kennedy and a minority of other liberals wishing perhaps for the return of the good old days of Bill Simon to the Treasury. And it produced finally a demand at the last moment for an increase in the defense budget, which not only torpedoed the whole House budget resolution and process, but left, I expect, Speaker O'Neill wondering if he wouldn't be better off having Mel Laird back at the Pentagon. Encouraged by this splendid triumph, the reformers have now moved into the area of ethics legislation, which has produced a great volume of work. This is the Senate bill, which advises Senator Kennedy as to how to behave himself. In more compact form, we have here the House Official Code of Conduct. If Representative Stockman should find himself in a moment of extreme moral temptation, he need do no more than reach into his pocket, open his code of conduct, and determine what it is that he is supposed to do under these trying circumstances. And to take just an example of the thoughtfulness and thoroughness of this approach, and this would be my final comment, Senator, in case, for example, Mr. Stockman is worried as to whether he can legally and morally accept reimbursement of his expenses for this conference, he can look into advisory opinion number 2 issued by the Select Committee on Ethics of the House of Representatives and find a very thorough discussion of the fact that while an individual's expenses for a meeting or conference, including transportation, food, and lodging, would exceed the aggregate figure of $100, there should be considered an offset of that, equal consideration for the services provided to that organization. For example, addressing an audience, and I assume this is why you sought membership on this panel, at an event or engaging in discussion seminars would be considered substantial participation, sufficient to constitute equal consideration, while simply visiting a specific site or location as part of a fact-finding tour would probably not be viewed as equal consideration for expenses paid by a sponsoring organization. It may seem to you that we have somehow cleansed or improved the political process by this kind of remarkable guidance. I am just glad that I can remember the days when politics was not beanbag.
Speak for us, Dave, now.
Well, I want to begin by just saying in response to Dave that you can set your mind at ease. I haven't been offered any expense money, so I'm not going to have to read that. The reason that our code of ethics is so much smaller and thinner than that of the Senate is that we have less need for it.
If you look at it, Dave, you'll see it's smaller print. That's the only difference.
And I also wanted to say that I was disappointed, Senator, that you didn't mention that in my biography that I spent 2 years at Harvard Divinity School. Right. And the reason that I bring that up is that during that entire 2 years I spent at Harvard Divinity School, I never heard a more eloquent sermon than John Gardner just delivered. And the problem, though, is that maybe we really don't need a sermon on the topic of political reform. I'm in a very uncomfortable position. I agree with almost every one of your solutions, and I've sponsored all the common cause bills, and I'll probably get a pretty good rating if you put one out. But I disagree most strenuously with most of the reasons that you arrive at these solutions and the rationale that you've outlined. Now, I think we have a serious problem of money in politics, but I don't think it's a problem that's of a moral character because it corrupts people or that it's used for bribery or the kind of Watergate syndrome. I also think that we have a need for reporting and for sunshine and for disclosure and some of the other reform measures that we've adopted. But I don't think it's going to improve very much public confidence in government. In fact, we've had reporting now in campaigns for 3 elections since 1972. We've had open committee meetings and open markup ever since 1974. But if you look at the indicators, public confidence has continued to decline. Public participation in the elections has continued to decline. And so what all this comes to, at least in my view, is that we've had probably too superficial, too thin of rationale or understanding as to what we're doing with reform. And I'd like to put another whole perspective or framework on the table, because I think we need reform, but I think we need a more fundamental reason, a more fundamental justification and understanding of what we're doing. As far as I'm concerned, the fundamental problem that we have in our democracy and our society today is that in government, particularly national government, we have a tremendous asymmetry of power between those who have a stake in the decision outcome and who have a membership organization that they can mobilize and who have communications facilities by which they can mobilize or activate their members at a moment's notice, and who have paid representation and presence in Washington and before the committees and the subcommittees where the decisions are really made, and who can mobilize campaign resources and contributions and so forth. Between that spectrum of groups on the one hand and the basically inarticulated and diffuse and latent interests that I believe very much need to be represented in the political decision-making equation. Now let me just put this in a little bit different perspective. The providers or producers of a good, whether it be oil, construction work, milk, daycare, or a hydroelectric project, are almost always going to be better represented before Congress or before the relevant committees than the consumers of those goods and services and products. Regulated industries and occupations, whether it be the airlines, and the Senator has been working in that area and I think would agree with me, but whether it be the airlines, the merchant marine, grapefruit growers, thrift institutions, or trucking companies, are almost always better represented than the users of those institutions. And the same is true on the third area, and that is government revenue users and government beneficiaries, whether the largesse is tax subsidies, impact aid grants, defense installations, Lockheed loans, CETA funds, or peanut subsidies, are almost always more, have almost always more impact and more presence and more influence on that final decision outcome of government than do the tax providers, the taxpayers. That's the fundamental problem we have, and when we're talking about reform, it seems to me that we ought to be talking about devising institutions and devising rules of the game that are going to help to shift that imbalance of power, that asymmetry, back towards providing an opportunity for the interest of the latent, the diffuse, the unrepresented group of taxpayers and consumers and general users in this society to be represented in the government process. And so when we look at reform, those are the reasons that I'm looking at, and I think they have some pretty clear implications as to what reform ought to consist of. And number one, to me, it has to be anti-PAC. It has to be, and that means political action committee. It has to be anti-organized interest group, because they have all kinds of built-in advantages already. They have a reason to mobilize, because most of the decisions of government are life or death matter to them. One simple illustration, if we raise the price support for milk by 5%, that's a $500 million worth of revenue to the milk producers in this country. It's 2 cents a quart for the milk users or for the milk consumers, so you see who gets mobilized. They have the membership organizations and all the other built-in advantages even prior to the electoral process and the provisions of electoral resources that I've mentioned. Now, what can we do to shift the electoral resource equation away from these groups that already have the built-in advantages already? Well, number one, I think we can cut the contribution limits way back from where they are today. They're $5,000, but that really doesn't mean too much, because it's $5,000 in the general election, it's $5,000 in the primary, If you can proliferate your committee by having various state and regional subdivisions, you can make almost unlimited contributions. I think those ought to be cut back to $1,000. We ought to tighten the anti-proliferation rules so that we really constrain very tightly the ability of these organized interests to provide resources for the campaign process. I think also we've got to have public financing to take the place of these resources that are eliminated. The second thing that I think we have to do is make sure that when we're devising reform procedures or programs that they're anti-incumbent. And that may sound kind of strange for me to say because I'm an incumbent. But nevertheless, it's the long-term incumbency process which makes this system work the way it does today. And so therefore, if you put any kind of spending limitation on elections or on finances and campaigns, you're really accomplishing the opposite of reform. Because when you consider all the advantages that incumbents have built in, their access to the press, the free frank, the huge staffs we get, all of the other resources that are available today, if you put a sharp spending limit on what can be spent in the campaign, there's no way in the world that challengers are going to have a decent opportunity at the polls. But nevertheless, if we want to deal with this fundamental problem we have in democracy, then we're going to have to tilt the rules of the game in the political process in an anti-incumbent direction. I also think they have to be tilted in a pro-party direction. Now, what we've had take place in the electorate is that it's been splintered into 1,000 different organized interest groups who are concerned about the price of milk, or who are concerned about a dealer's day in court bill, or who are concerned about the level of funding for daycare programs. But we really don't have many institutions that represent the viewpoint, the interests of the general taxpayer and the general consumer who get saddled with the costs of all these governmental efforts. I think parties can do that. But as long as we continue to stack the rules of the game in terms of some of the reforms that we've adopted, as Dave Broder has indicated, against parties, we're only going to compound the fundamental problem that we have today. So what we ought to do is take all strings off parties completely. There shouldn't be a $10,000 spending limit on what the Massachusetts Democratic Party can give to the senator in his campaign, and it shouldn't be on what the Republican National Committee can give to me in my campaign. Also, as Professor Burns has indicated, parties should be eligible for public funding. If we could bring the parties into the public funding process, I think we would strengthen them immeasurably, and basically we would strengthen an institution which can be an aggregating vehicle that will represent broader interests than those political vehicles that we have today. And then finally, I think that our rules of reform or our approach on reform ought to be pro-citizen in its orientation. But I don't mean that in some kind of idealized view where everybody becomes a full-time political activist. I mean it more in the sense that when people are encouraged to act politically and engage in the political process, they ought to be encouraged to act as citizens, not as someone who works on a construction site or who works in a thrift institution or who is a member of a maritime union. They ought to be encouraged to act as citizens, or citizens qua citizen. And I think one way we can do that would be to give political organizations and political candidates an incentive to go out and encourage people in that capacity to participate. And that's why I very strongly believe that matching payments are the way to put public money into campaigns and not lump sum subsidies. Because if we say to every candidate for the House or the Senate, you're going to get $100,000 or $1 million if you qualify and get on the general election ballot, there's going to be no incentive whatever for those candidates and those parties to go out and encourage people to participate as citizens. But if we tell them that before you can get public money, you have to go out and get a $25 or $50 or $75 contribution from hundreds of citizens across your district or even thousands, then I think we're going to be providing some very powerful incentives for candidates and for political organizations to go out and cultivate that kind of grassroots constituency. So those are some of the basic comments that I would make. I would boil it down or bring it into conclusion by saying that we've got to have a more serious purpose for reform than merely trying to clean up the superficial moral aspects of politics. But we've got to look at some of the fundamental realities of power in our government process today.
Bring it all together, Barney.
I was just going to ask you, Senator, what you've been doing with all that money the Massachusetts Democratic State Committee has apparently been giving you that we didn't know about. I'm not going to try and be coherent. but because I want to make a couple of kind of specific points and I guess response to things that go on earlier. I am not much of a reformer at all these days. My own sense of it is that there are substantive goals that are more important to me. I think I have an obligation to be honest personally, but I am not much of a cop by nature. I will tell you, although this is not the direct topic, that I think any of you who think that legislative ethics committees, no matter how many commandments they've got, are going to be serious. I mean, peer group policing doesn't even work with West Point cadets. And if you think it's going to work with full-grown adult politicians, you're crazy. We simply are not going to sit around and blow the whistle on each other with any degree of regularity, and if that's your hope, forget it. Now, the first point I want to get into where I think that reform is absolutely essential is public financing. Private campaign contributions are bribes. We have hunting season in Massachusetts. You can kill deer some months. You can't kill them the other month. You can bribe politicians in October of even years. You can't bribe politicians in May of odd years. The fact is that the overwhelming majority of money given is given by people who have an interest in what you're going to do. Now, I have to differ with David Broder on 2 points. One, factually, the fact that Jimmy Carter double-crossed the NAACP, among others, has nothing to do with the public finance law, because blacks have never in this country, unfortunately, been able to be heavy givers. They haven't had the dough. What influence the NAACP had, they had in 76 as much as 72. It was their votes. And, in fact, they delivered for Jimmy Carter, and he didn't do what they wanted. So the campaign finance law was no part of their problem with Griffin Bell and Pete Flaherty. As far as the AFL-CIO is concerned, yeah, I think public financing has reduced the influence of the labor movement on Democratic presidents. I only wish it would do it for me and my colleagues. As a matter of fact, I don't mind that the President of the United States can do what he thinks is right about imports without worrying about cash from the AFL-CIO. I think he ought to have to worry about their votes. I really think it's that simple a point. The valid measure in a democracy ought to be your vote, measured by and modified by what David Stockman correctly pointed out, the degree of intensity that you have. The more you care about an issue, the more involved you'll get. But I got to tell you, again, it's human nature that people keep... The Pope and I differ a lot less theologically than we used to. Since I've been in politics, we agree on human nature. His approach is it's original sin is the key. He has an a priori approach and mine is empirical. But I think that's the central fact of politics. And the fact is, there is simply no way in the world that a perfect stranger can give me $500 to help me do something I want very much, which is to get reelected, and for me to forget about it. It just doesn't work that way. I don't know people. I know one person who does it, I must tell you, the governor of Massachusetts. And I say this, no, I say this, I really mean to say this admiringly. He is the only perfect ingrate I've ever met in politics, and it takes, but I stress it, and I don't say that to seriously. I mean, I stress that to say that that's the degree to which it's unusual. I got to tell you, I don't think I'm a guy heavily influenced by contributors. But if I come back to my office and I got a half hour and 15 people have called me, I'll first call back the reporters and then I'll probably call back the campaign contributors. That's the way it is. You don't ignore perfect strangers giving you money. And none of you out here in your daily business are expected to take money all the time from perfect strangers and not have it have any influence on you. Only we are. And it does have an influence. So I think public financing is absolutely essential. It won't make people be honest who want to steal under the table, but it will let people be honest, which is what I think the majority of politicians want to do most of the time. Next, in terms of electoral reform, I think my difference with John Gardner's general approach is, and it may go back to this, the question is, where do you think the problems come in the system? And I agree with a lot of specifics on Common Cause, although there was a recent squib in the Lowell Sun, as I told John Gardner earlier, with regard to a Massachusetts elected official who was convicted in federal court, and it said so-and-so had a 100% Common Cause record. That was the total item in the Lowell Sun. But the problem is some of the stuff I don't think makes much difference. By the way, I can say it has apparently helped in Washington. On the Massachusetts level, I forget which sun, Sunlight, the open government stuff. Sunshine. Makes no difference. There's no way you stop three guys from going to the bathroom and turning on the shower and making the deal, coming back out, I know, and it's all done. I mean, it may work differently in Washington, but I do not think sunshine laws have made any difference in Massachusetts state government at all. I don't think sunset laws will make any difference in the Massachusetts state government. Those are the ones where you abolish things. And we have things around because the kind of vested interests that Dave Stockman talked about have attached themselves to them and support them. They're not there because people forgot about them. But my fundamental problem is, and it relates, I think, to my difference with Jim Burns, too. The problem with electoral reform for me, and I share what I think is the correct perspective that Jim Burns put into it, that when you're talking about political reform, I think there are two things. One, we are committed to democracy. And I think all of us feel that to be legitimate, for me to have a right to send a man with a gun to tell you what to do and what not to do, there has to be public participation in democracy. But there are a lot of morally neutral choices we can make. Within a framework of things which are equally democratic, we can choose. Do we want strong parties or weak parties? I don't think democratic moral theory gives you one argument or the other. The question tends to be, I think, for most of us, pragmatic. What's going to produce the results we most like? And I would agree with Jim Burns that I want to see public policy in this country more oriented towards helping the mass of people who are at the lowest end of the economic scale. I guess my general